Tim Cook, the CEO who risked it all for Apple's soul. What is a soul worth when a trillion-dollar company puts it on stage? At Apple Park, under a ring of glass and morning light, a man in a black shirt walks a perfect loop. A billion eyes wait for the next iPhone and for a promise called Apple Intelligence. Hardware ritual meets an idea under pressure. If values are expensive, will he pay the bill? It is iPhone week at Apple Park. Outside, the lines have already formed. Inside, the air is quiet enough to hear footfalls on stone. The date, September 12th, 2025. The day pre-orders open. In 7 days, on September 19th, the iPhone 17 family and a new ultra-slim iPhone Air will hit stores. Headlines will pass camera bumps and chip nodes, battery life and bezels, but the real story is different and riskier. This week, he is balancing a brand built on hardware with a new center of gravity, Apple Intelligence, AI designed to live on your device, not in someone else's data center. At the same time, he is rewriting how a trillion-dollar supply chain moves. This morning, reports out of India say Foxconn's ramp continues despite diplomatic bumps, another step in a years-long plan to diversify production beyond China. The phrasing sounds routine. The shift is seismic. The man in that black shirt is Timothy Donald Cook. Tim, born November 1st, 1960, 64 years old as of today, Chief Executive Officer of Apple Inc., a steward of the world's most valuable consumer technology brand, and, more to the point, the person who has decided again and again that the soul of that brand matters more than winning the news cycle. This is the story of how Tim Cook risked it all for Apple's soul, how a quiet operator became a values-first CEO, turning process into principle, and risking convenience, popularity, and profit to keep that soul intact. The central question lands early. What does a leader owe to values when values are expensive? Privacy when governments demand backdoors? Dignity when your manufacturing base spans continents? Honesty when a product stumbles? Vision when a decade-long dream isn't working? Over the next 45 minutes, we'll follow one of the quietest, most consequential figures in Silicon Valley as he confronts moments that could have broken the company, and sometimes, in choosing the harder path, makes it stronger. If you like your stories in 3 acts, here's the arc. The fixer who engineers scale, the heir who inherits a myth, the decider who makes values non-negotiable in an AI age. But first, before the trillion-dollar milestones and the keynote cadence, there was a boy from Alabama, a factory floor, and a gut decision that changed everything. Tim Cook's story begins far from Cupertino, Alabama, and the small town of Robertsdale. His father, a shipyard worker. His mother, a pharmacy employee. Ordinary work, long days, a world where reliability mattered more than rhetoric. At Auburn University, he studied industrial engineering, graduated in 1982. He would later earn an MBA from Duke University in 1988, named a Fuqua Scholar. Discipline and patience traced cleanly through his 20s. Before Apple, there was IBM. 12 years, rising to Director of North American Fulfillment, then a stint as COO at Intelligent Electronics Reseller Division, then Vice President of Corporate Materials at Compaq. supply chains and logistics, not the romantic center of technology, but the skeleton everything else hangs on. He learned that the wrong part, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, can stall an entire machine. He also learned the inverse: discipline compounds. The hinge turns in the spring of 1998. Apple, struggling, newly electrified by Steve Jobs' return, needed an operations chief for a fight that would be won or lost in the quiet. Jobs invited Cook to Cupertino. There was a conversation, a sense. Later, in a 2010 Auburn address, Cook would describe the moment as intuition that overruled his spreadsheets. By any conventional metric, joining Apple looked foolish. The numbers said no. His gut said yes. He listened to his gut. On a Monday morning in 1998, Tim Cook walked into Apple as Senior Vice President of Worldwide Operations. The company he joined was fragile. The company he would help build was anything but. And just ahead, the quiet operator would be handed the loudest job in tech. Cook's early Apple mantra was famous for a reason. Inventory is fundamentally evil. He meant it. Inventory is oxygen for inefficiency. It hides mistakes. It ties up cash. It goes stale like dairy. He cut supplier lists. He slashed inventory days from months to days. He pre-booked air freight capacity to move critical components across oceans in time for launches. He reorganized manufacturing around a just-in-time rhythm that let Apple go from unveiling to global release without drowning in parts that might be obsolete in a quarter. It looked like logistics. It was leverage. The iPod era sharpened the edge. The iPhone era demanded something more audacious, manufacturing at a scale and precision the industry had never seen. China became the pivot. Cook cultivated deep partnerships with Foxconn and others. Factories like cities, workforces numbering in the hundreds of thousands across vast campuses. The choreography of components landing at the right station at the right second. The payoff was day one launches that felt like holidays. He wasn't blind to the human cost. In 2012, under intense scrutiny of working conditions, Apple invited the Fair Labor Association to audit Foxconn facilities, unusual for a secretive company. The audits documented wage and overtime violations and commitments to remediation. No press release could sanitize the complexity, but the message was clear: we will look, we will measure, we will fix. Imperfect, ongoing, real. Here, a unique angle surfaces: operations as moral philosophy. A supply chain isn't just bolts and lead times, it's a map of values. Cook's discipline wasn't merely efficiency, it was ethic, removing waste, friction, and denial from a system so that trust could be shipped on time. He understood that the most valuable product Apple made was trust, and you cannot ship trust late. This is where the future CEO emerges, not as a showman, but as a builder of systems and a manager of contradictions, speed and safety, scale and dignity, pricing power and fair wages. The work is procedural and precise. The stakes are human. And soon the question would shift from how to build Apple to how to carry it. August 24th, 2011. Steve Jobs resigns as CEO of Apple. In his letter to the board and to the world, he recommends Tim Cook as his successor. 6 weeks later, on October 5th, Jobs is gone. In that interval, the world held its breath, and then exhaled grief. Cook walked onto a stage he did not ask for, and that no one could truly prepare for. The question from pundits and fans alike was simple: Would Apple be Apple without Steve? Cook's answer wasn't a speech, it was a way of working. He made early moves that signaled a distinct leadership style. In September 2012, when Apple Maps shipped with embarrassing flaws, Cook issued a rare open letter of apology. Plain spoken, direct. "We fell short," he wrote. "We are extremely sorry." He went further. Until Apple could fix Maps, he recommended competitors, an act of corporate humility that would have been unthinkable under Jobs. The apology didn't erase the failure. It did something else. It taught the world how Tim Cook would handle one, with candor, with steps attached, with a tone that treated customers like adults. Honesty over mystique becomes policy, not posture. There were other moments that revealed the man, not just the manager. In 2009, during Jobs' health crisis, Cook quietly offered to donate part of his liver. Jobs refused. Cook only spoke about it years later, and even then, with restraint. The gesture mattered. It was loyalty without theatre. It was also a limit. Cook would do everything he could for a friend and a boss, but he would not cross the boundary of consent. Love held inside a line you won't cross. Under Cook, Apple kept shipping. iPhone grew into the central device in modern life. iPhone or iWatch arrived in 2015. AirPods followed. Services like Apple Pay and Music matured into a second revenue engine. By August 2018, Apple became the first US company to hit a $1 trillion market cap. By 2020, it crossed $2 trillion. In 2023, it closed above $3 trillion. Numbers that felt absurd until they didn't. And yet, the story of Tim Cook, why risked it all applies, doesn't live in market caps. It lives in the stands he chose to take, when they could have cost him everything. Which brings us to the moment when identity and principle step fully into the light. On October 30th, 2014, Tim Cook published an essay in Bloomberg Businessweek. The line that traveled the world was simple: "I'm proud to be gay, and I consider being gay among the greatest gifts God has given me." With that sentence, he became the first openly gay CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He framed the announcement not as confession, but as service, to offer visibility in places where visibility could save a kid's life. Identity as leadership, a personal truth used as a public shield. It's hard to describe how unusual that was, and still is, in the upper reaches of corporate America. For Cook, it wasn't a brand play, it was a boundary. Apple would be a place where equality was not a slogan. In the years that followed, he opposed discriminatory religious freedom bills, spoke for LGBTQ+ rights, and backed those words with institutional action, most notably the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative announced in 2020, which grew beyond $200 million under Lisa Jackson's stewardship. It funded education, economic empowerment, and criminal justice reform, a mix of grants and Apple-specific programs aiming to leave something better than slogans behind. Then, in Brussels on October 24, 2018, Cook delivered a keynote that crystallized his philosophy on privacy. He warned of a data industrial complex and declared, in a sentence he repeats as creed, privacy is a fundamental human right. He called for comprehensive US privacy legislation. In a valley enamored of surveillance economics, Cook chose a different center of gravity. He wasn't against machine learning or personalization. He was against the premise that your life, sliced into 1,000 behavioral shards, should be bought and sold behind your back. Values are easy in keynote decks. They are harder when law enforcement knocks. And soon, it did. February 16, 2016. A federal court in California orders Apple to help the FBI unlock an iPhone that belonged to one of the San Bernardino attackers. The government wants Apple to create a special version of iOS that would let them brute force the passcode without triggering the device's auto-erase protections. Apple refuses. Cook publishes a message to our customers. The letter is stern, almost austere. This moment calls for public discussion, he writes. Weakening encryption, even for this case, would undermine the very freedoms and liberty our government is meant to protect. He is explicit. If Apple builds a system to break one iPhone, it will be used to break many, and not just by good guys. It was the highest stakes stand of his tenure to that point. The FBI framed the fight as public safety. Cook framed it as human safety. The integrity of a device that held your health, your finances, your home security system, your children's photos. The immediate battle fizzled when the government found another way into the phone. The war continued, in policy, in public expectation, in the daily architecture of how Apple built its products. Cook doubled down. End-to-end encryption expanded. In 2022, after announcing a child sexual abuse material scanning system that would detect known CSAM and iCloud photos, Apple reversed course amid backlash from privacy and civil liberties advocates. They scrapped the plan, strengthened communication safety features to protect children in iMessage, and hardened iCloud with expanded end-to-end encryption. The tension between safety and privacy did not vanish. It settled into a truce built on two beliefs. Children must be protected. Back doors are back doors, no matter how nobly named. Politics pressed from other angles, too. Apple's China dependence was both a triumph of operational mastery and a geopolitical vulnerability. Cook cultivated relationships at the highest levels in Beijing, navigated tariffs and shifting rules, and meanwhile began pulling on a harder lever: diversification. India, Vietnam, elsewhere. In 2025, as the iPhone 17 ramped in India, headlines noted staffing reshuffles and official assurances that production would continue. The goal was not to abandon China. It was to reduce any single point of failure in a world where single points of failure have a habit of breaking. And then there was antitrust. In the US, Epic Games v. Apple narrowed some App Store practices, most notably rules around anti-steering, which restrict how developers can inform users about alternate payment options, while upholding Apple's right to run its own store. In Europe, the Digital Markets Act arrived with sharper teeth. In 2025, Apple faced a €500 million fine over anti-steering. The company revised EU rules, argued they were compliant, and appealed. Regulators saw gatekeeping. Apple saw security and cohesion. Developers saw both costs and opportunity. Consumers saw payments where links used to be. Cook saw principle and risk. The store that underwrote a privacy-centric business model could not become a free-for-all. The courts and time would decide how much of that model could remain. Which is why the next chapter widens the canvas beyond a single device. On February 2, 2024, Apple Vision Pro arrived in the United States, spatial computing, as Apple described it. It was expensive, heavy, undeniably ambitious. Skeptics saw a niche, luxury. Believers saw a first-generation device in a long arc that began in a lab and would end on faces in public. Cook saw both. the difficulty of pushing a new category into the world, and the necessity of doing it anyway. Then, on February 27, 2024, Apple cancelled its decade-long electric car project. Hundreds of engineers were reassigned to artificial intelligence initiatives. The car had devoured time and money. It had also, in the end, collided with the brutal physics of manufacturing and regulation in a field where Apple's DNA, tight integration, obsessive control, met realities it could not easily bend. Killing it was both a surrender and a liberation. It clarified priorities. It declared that the battle for the next decade would be in intelligence, not in drivetrains. Killing a dream to protect a soul. And so, Apple Intelligence emerged not as a single product, but as a strategy across them all. It promised machine learning stitched into the daily texture of using a phone, a tablet, a computer. It promised on-device models for speed and privacy, and private cloud compute when tasks needed more horsepower. Servers architected so your data couldn't be seen by anyone, including Apple. It promised a wiser Siri, and in 2024, it surprised some by integrating ChatGPT, framed not as surrender to outside AI, but as a pragmatic way to answer questions Siri was not yet good at, always with user permission and privacy constraints. It promised humility in a field that also demands audacity. Cook's bet was that Apple could lead in a world hungry for AI without abandoning the values that made people trust the brand in the first place. If AI was going to touch your calendar, your notes, your photos, your messages, your life, then it had to be held to a different standard than a novelty on the web. This, more than any product launch, was the risk in risking it all. If Apple got it wrong, if privacy buckled under convenience, if the assistant that knew you best started sharing that knowledge with an ecosystem built on ads, the soul of the company would be compromised in exchange for a few seasons of hype. Cook's move was to make privacy the point, not the price. The motif returned: no backdoors, everything through the front door, by consent or not at all. And while AI grabbed headlines, another ledger, quieter, greener, kept ticking in the background. Not all gambles wear capes. Some look like pre-dawn routines. Colleagues say Tim Cook wakes early, often between 4 and 5 a.m. He plows through customer emails. He reads complaints, suggestions, gratitude, fury. He reads to keep a hand on the pulse, he says. Then the gym, then the day. The rhythm is almost monastic, but not joyless. Before product unveilings, he sometimes jokes about his habits, once sleeping in till 4:30. The jokes land because the results do. The pulse is a motif. Customers as heartbeat, not noise. He brings the same discipline to the boardroom beyond tech. In 2005, he joined Nike's board, later chairing its compensation committee. The cross-pollination runs deeper than a swoosh on a wrist, a shared obsession with design, with the feeling of a thing in a hand, or on a foot. It is not a coincidence that Apple's retail feels like a museum of need, and Nike's best stores feel like kinetic temples. Both speak a language where materials and ethics are not afterthoughts. He is no arena showman. He is measured, collaborative, candid in crisis. That contrast with Jobs, who could cut an enemy with a sentence, creates a dramatic foil in our minds. But it's a mistake to equate decibels with force. Cook's force is procedural. He will move methodically, and then, suddenly, all at once.
Consider the environment.
Apple says it has surpassed a 60% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions versus 2015 on the path to Apple 2030 carbon neutral goals. Suppliers in semiconductors and displays have pledged at least 90% abatement of potent fluorinated greenhouse gases for Apple-related production by 2030. In practice, that means aluminum smelters switching methods, energy grids greening, shipping choices changing, and 1,000 line items in a component bill being measured for heat. In culture, it means telling customers that the greenest device is often the one you already own. The contradiction: selling millions of new phones while preaching sustainability is not easily resolved. Cook's answer is to keep pushing the numbers down while the world keeps buying. Hypocrisy? Perhaps. Progress? Also, yes. In these spaces, two things can be true.
The motif of inventory returns. Waste is not just capital trapped in boxes, it's carbon trapped in the sky. Inventory is fundamentally evil, extends beyond pallets into the atmosphere. And strategy speaks again in this week's headlines. India is not simply a market of 1 billion potential customers. It is a manufacturing proposition, a diversification hedge, and a statement of intent. Moving significant iPhone production there requires years of groundwork, supplier ecosystems, logistics, training, quality control that meets a bar set in Shenzhen and Zhengzhou. It also requires diplomacy, patience, and a willingness to be told no by reality until yes becomes possible. Reports that production ramps continue despite staffing reshuffles and political churn are mundane on the surface and proof of a shift designed to remove single points of failure from Apple's machine. Not because China is the enemy, because concentration is. And every morning at 4 a.m., the next test lands in his inbox. Apple says it has already cut global emissions by more than 60% compared to 2015 on the path to Apple 2030. Suppliers are committing to cut the nastiest greenhouse gases in displays and semiconductors by 90% by the end of the decade. The Racial Equity and Justice Initiative continues, aiming to turn dollars into durable change. These are not product cycles, they are generational commitments. The immediate future is clearer. In a week, the first iPhone 17s and the iPhone Air will leave stores in careful white bags, their boxes opening like books the design team spent months getting right. Apple Intelligence will start to live where Siri used to stall. European Union regulators will continue to demand changes. United States courts will continue to narrow and widen rules in alternating rhythms. India will make more iPhones. China will still matter. Developers will still argue. Customers will still line up. And somewhere in that ring of glass in Cupertino, a man in a black shirt will wake before dawn, read, lift, decide. Tim Cook often says he wants Apple to leave the world better than we found it. It's the kind of sentence that floats past you in a keynote until you set it against a ledger of choices. Then it sharpens. Leaving the world better is not a marketing line. It's a promise and a trap for the insincere. The tests currently on the table: AI without surveillance, supply chains without exploitation, growth without emissions, prosperity without monopoly, aren't problems with clean answers. They are tensions. Which is why it matters that the person holding them knows how to sit inside a contradiction without lying to himself. On October 5th,
2011, 6 weeks after he became CEO, Tim Cook stood on a stage and faced a world asking whether Apple could outlive the man who made it mythic. 14 years later, the world's most valuable company is led by someone who knows myth is the least durable part of a brand. Soul is not myth. It's memory plus habit plus choice under pressure. It's apologizing when you're wrong. It's refusing to build a back door when it's easier to say yes. It's canceling a car to focus on the intelligence that will matter more. It's telling a teenager in Robertsdale, Alabama, that there is a future where your choices can tilt a company and maybe a culture toward dignity. So when we say Tim Cook risked it all for Apple's soul, we are not romanticizing. We are naming a pattern. Again and again, when it would have been cheaper to cut a corner or louder to sell a story, he chose the longer road. He did it quietly. He did it stubbornly. He did it with a gentleness that masked steel. And that may be the legacy, not just the trillion-dollar milestones or the devices on our desks, but a template for power used with restraint, privacy by default, security by design, and values that show up when it's costly, not performative, but practiced. The week ends, the phones ship, the counters roll over to the next thing, and in the spaces between the metrics, a standard holds: privacy by default, security by design, values under pressure. Not perfect, not propaganda, a standard. What does a leader owe to values when values are expensive? In Tim Cook's case, he owed everything and paid again and again with the coin of consequence. The result is a company that still feels like itself after the man who defined it is gone. That, in the end, is what we mean by soul.
Thank you for joining us for Modern Biography, the stories that define our time. If this journey through Tim Cook's life and leadership made you think differently about the technology in your pocket and the choices behind it, stay with us. The next story begins where this one leaves off, with a decision, a deadline, and a person who believes that doing the right thing fully, publicly, and at cost is how you build something that lasts.